Hey guys, this is lesson 1.3, properties of addition and multiplication. These properties that we're about to go over, we went over last year, so hopefully most of this is just a review. Here we're going to start off by learning a new phrase or term, and that is equivalent expressions. Expressions with the same value, like 12 plus 7 and 7 plus 12, they're going to have the same answer. They're called equivalent expressions because they're expressions that will equal the same thing. Now, the commutative and associative properties that we learned last year can be used to write these equivalent expressions. Let's review them really quickly. So here we have the commutative property. I hope that you remember the base word, or the root word, shall I say. The root word that is commute. The root word is commute, and commute means to travel. So the commutative property is when two numbers switch places because they're traveling. So 5 plus 8, they can switch places and be 8 plus 5, and that's okay. That's the commutative property. Same thing with multiplication, 5 times 8 or 8 times 5. Those are equivalent expressions because they equal the same thing. Now in algebra, we use letters. So A plus B or B plus A, it's the same thing. A times B, B times A, it's the same thing. I want to remind you, we talked about this last year, but that only works for addition and multiplication. It does not work for subtraction or division. All right? Associative property, the root word we talked about last year was to associate, which means different groups. The order does not change, but the grouping changes. So in this case, we have 7 plus 4 plus 2. And here we have 7 plus 4 plus 2. You just switch the parentheses. You remember that? So you can just switch the parentheses without changing the order of your numbers. Same thing with multiplication, 7 times 4 times 2, or 7 times 4 times 2. Same thing, but the parentheses are different. In algebra, we do the exact same thing, but we use letters. A plus B plus C, A plus B plus C. It's the same letters in the same order, but different parentheses. Same thing with multiplication. All right, so let's move on. Here we're going to simplify this expression, and we have to use the properties that we've learned. So here, notice, we cannot, this is very, 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 very important. You cannot take something out of a parentheses and switch it with something inside of parentheses. Okay? So you can't take something out of parentheses and switch it with something that's already on the outside. So we could not, mind you, we cannot write x plus 12 plus 7. We could not switch those two. This does not work because you can only use the associative property to change parentheses. So notice here, we did not change the order 7, 12x, 7, 12x. We just moved the parentheses. And when we do that, we can say, hey, we use the associative property of addition. That allows you to simplify the expression because now we can combine, that 7 and 12. Okay? So we can add 7 and 12 and get 19. Once you add it, those parentheses are gone, and now we just have 19 plus x, which is our simplified expression. All right, our next one. On our next one, this one's trickier because if we switch those parentheses like we did in A, it wouldn't put our numbers together. This is what we would get. 6 plus 1 plus x plus 8.4. Oh, our numbers are still not together. That didn't help us at all. So let me show you. You can use two properties. First, we're going to switch the order inside the parentheses only. So we're going to switch the 6 plus 1 and x, and then we switch it around. Now, because they traveled, we can say we use the commutative property of addition. Now that the 6 plus 1 and the 8.4 are next to each other, we can move the parentheses and use the associative property. Once they're together, we can just add them and get x plus 14.5. All right, that's the tricky part. You can't switch something outside of parentheses with something inside of parentheses. It doesn't work that way. You have to use the commutative property to get them in the right order first. All right, let's do another one. Simplify the expression. Notice our numbers, 5 and 11, are already next to each other. So all we have to do is move the parentheses. Then we can multiply, and we're done. Moving the parentheses, again, is associative property. All right, let's learn some more properties. Addition property of 0, or I want you to know its other term. It's also called the identity property. The 7th grade textbook uses the term identity property. So I want you to be familiar with that so that you're not learning different properties in each year. Identity property. The 5th grade book also teaches the identity property. All right, so the identity property is when something doesn't change. It keeps its identity. In addition, something keeps its identity if you add by 0. All right, so that's the addition property of 0, or identity property. If you add 0, it stays the same. It keeps its identity. All right, now identity property also works when you multiply something by 1. All right, because it still keeps its identity. 4 times 1 is still 4. So that's also called the identity property. Another phrase for it is the multiplication property of 1. Now we also have what's called the multiplication property of 0, and that's when you multiply something by 0. And whenever that happens, you will always get the answer 0. Okay? Now, with numbers, we use numbers, but in algebra, notice we're adding in these letters again, because algebra uses letters. All right, let's try some examples. Notice the 9 times 0 are already next to each other, so we don't have to change order, so we're not using commutative property, but we do want to do that first. If we did order of operations, we would do 9 times 0 anyways. If you want to add the parentheses around them, that would be associative property. But this step is actually not necessary since order of operations tells us to do that first anyway. But once you multiply it, you get 0. That is the multiplication property of 0. And once you multiply p times 0 as well, you still get 0. So it's still multiplication property of 0. All right, so that's that property. When you multiply something and you get 0, it's called the multiplication property of 0. Next example, we have simplify the expression. Now I want you to notice, this is the first thing you should look for, are the numbers next to each other? No. So do we need to move them so they're next to each other? Well, first, let's think about it. What is it? It's 1. Can we multiply 1 times r? Well, yes, actually we could. So we don't have to change the order. So here we go. We're going to do the r times 1 first. That means we're going to put a parenthesis around the r and the 1. So we have to say that we use the associative property by adding those parentheses. Once we multiply it, r times 1 is still r. So that's the multiplication property of 1, or identity property, because it kept its identity of r. All right, 4.5 times r is just 4.5 times r. So that's the final answer there. All right, you and 6 friends play on a basketball team. Now I want you to really notice you and 6 friends. That's a very common error. Whenever people see you and 6 friends, they think, oh, there's 6 people. But you have to count yourself, so it should be 7 people, all right? A sponsor paid $100 for the league fee, X dollars for each player's t-shirt, and $68.25 for trophies. Write an expression for the total amount paid by the sponsor. So notice an expression is just a long phrase putting it all together. So the sponsor paid $100 plus X dollars for each player and $68.25. So we need to add them all together in order to find the total that the sponsor paid. So 100 plus how many players? There's 7 players because it's you and 6 friends. So 7 times X because it's 7 players times X dollars, and then plus $68.25. All right? We then have to simplify that. So by simplifying it, we're going to switch the order of 100 instead of the X so we can get the 100 and the 68.25 together. Once we switch those, that's called the commutative property. And when we add it together, we are done. We don't know what X is, so we cannot simplify this anymore. If something has a letter, such as right here, you cannot add it with a number here until we figure out what that X is. And we don't know, and we can't figure it out, so we're just going to leave it like that. All right, if you have any questions about this specifically, because this is very, very important, please come and talk to me about it. I would love to elaborate on this thing right here. All right, that's the end. Go ahead and work on your classwork. If you have any questions, let me know. And then also, once you're done with that and check your answers, go ahead and start your homework.